I had Sergeant Davenport write his down because I didn't think he would complete it. Good job. I wrote mine down because I thought I might forget it. Mr. and Mrs. Mena, Miss Pat, Mr. Willie, and the rest of Senior Airman retired Anthony Tony Mena's family and friends, thank you for allowing us to honor Tony this afternoon. Also like to thank Major Jason Beers, the Security Force Commander, for showing up, and those in attendance today for accompany the Menas and the Security Force family in remembrance of Anthony Mena. Although our path has crossed before, the first memory I have of Tony was the day I signed into the unit last April. I showed up in training, and while processing in, Tony came over and introduced himself. With a smile and his chest swelled with pride, he said, "Welcome, Chief. I'm Senior Airman Mena, and we relieved you in the desert." He was referring to relieving me in December of 2006 when we were assigned to conduct Iraqi police transition training in Baghdad, Iraq. I stated, "Great job," and we'd have to talk, not knowing that he would take me up on that offer many times. And as I left, or as he walked off, I said, "And you're a hero." He went back to the desk to complete his work, but left me with that half grin looking at the side of his face, his chest still swelled with pride. When I arrived, Tony had someone on base to share his combat experience, someone who would understand, and someone to share the good, the bad, and the horrible experiences of war and the mission we had both completed. I can't speak of Tony's combat experiences while he performed the 365-day tour in Baghdad, accomplishing to date the most dangerous security force mission in Iraq. I can tell you some of my personal experiences, which probably were just 1/5 of what Tony experienced. We often were the first to respond to an IED blast, sometimes getting out to set up security, and only to realize we were now standing in what used to be a human being. Driving past an open market, only to see a vehicle stop, an individual get out and kill a pedestrian right there in front of you, and not be able to do anything about it. Maybe the worst part of the ordeal was finding a body that was what we called an EJK, extrajudicial killing. You see, we'd have to do a SLU report on how that person had died, identifying the bullet holes, the strangulation, the hands tied, the holes drilled in their body, flies landing on the dead body and then landing on you. This became the norm. Sometimes the family members arrived to pick up the body. The women would scream and slap themselves, the men in severe grief. And if it was a Shia and we were in a Sunni-controlled police station, most assuredly one of the cops was either involved in the kidnapping, torture, or the killing. And I had lost a comrade, warrior and hero, killed by a sniper during my tour, A1C Lee Bernard Chavis. You see, Tony had arrived in Baghdad with 160-plus personnel who only 3 months prior were sitting at 60 different bases across the world. They called themselves the wild cards. They were just normal people now delivered in an abnormal environment for 1 year. And worse, when they returned from their mission, they were again scattered, arriving at home stations only to PCS to a different location where barely anyone knew them. Tony was one of the few that stayed at their home station. Back to the normal world came these heroes who had spent so much time in the abnormal world. Unfortunately for Tony, Kirkland and the rest and most Air Force bases weren't prepared to treat their ailments or their experiences. Not stating they didn't try or provided substandard care, for the vast majority, the medical personnel here at Kirtland provided Tony excellent care. Tony had most of his doctor's personal cell phone numbers and would call them all hours, and they would try to help. You see, Tony was suffering from PTSD. PTSD is not new. Matter of fact, the first written documentation was 490 BC during the Battle of Marathon. An Athenian soldier suffered no physical injuries but returned from the battle blind. You see, he had saw his best friend killed in front of him. During the Civil War, soldiers would suddenly die of heart attacks called DaCosta syndrome, or soldier's heart. And during the world wars, it was called shell shock or battle fatigue. PTSD is not confined to war. During the 19th century, at the height of the railroad era, many train wrecks occurred, and survivors who suffered no physical injuries would file claims complaining about pain in their neck and back. It was called railway spine. With my arrival and invitation to talk, Tony spent numerous hours in my office talking about his experiences. He would physically change his appearance as he got closer to the hurt, guilt, of shame of not being there when a friend, brother, and comrade had been killed, Staff Sergeant Jason Self. His mind was controlling his body, and his body was in as much pain as his mind was in. I tried to help, tried to convince him he had successfully completed over 100 combat missions, and to think about that when the bad thoughts came. We would talk for hours, and I only hoped that I'd find that magic word that would allow him to turn those negative thoughts into something positive. Or at last resort, I just wanted to grab him and order that pain away. He didn't spend all the time in my office talking about his PTSD. Often he'd come in and tell me how I was messing up and not taking care of his airmen. You see, he was in charge of our sponsor program and took great pride in providing top-notch assistance to our newest offenders. He also kept his ear to the mission and would ensure I knew if some procedure or guidance wasn't working for his airmen. Mr. and Miss Mena, Pat, Willie, how proud you must be of the young man you raised. Although I only met Willie the day I found out Tony had died, I stood there as you spoke to us, utilizing the same thought process, the same mannerisms, the same train of thought, and the same pain I often saw when Tony spoke with me. Pat, I love you. Your heart is so large. Tony took after you when he watched over those who couldn't take care of themselves. He put them before himself. And rest assured, with me and everyone else in the SF family, your visits, emails, and phone calls were not duty. They were our love for you and Tony. God bless your family. Tony's experience has changed the Air Force and the Security Force career field. Now both the teams currently performing the PTT mission and the ones preparing for the mission undergo testing before, during, and after the deployment. Due in parts to Tony's experience and the efforts of Captain Watts, Chief Gamage, and most importantly General Hertog, the Air Force now has a program to help those suffering from PTSD. This may never happen, but in my mind it always will. When I see the numbers of casualties of Operation Iraqi Freedom, those brave men and women who gave their lives in defense of their country, I will always add a +1. A +1 for Tony. Willie, Pat, and family, always remember, you will always be part of this family, SF Defenders. God bless.